Hey everyone, so I've gotten a couple questions on Instagram and on TikTok of people asking what are the pros and cons of being a professional musician. And I figured I would address this, and very realistically, I sometimes sugarcoat what it's like a little bit, but I thought in this video I would tell you the honest truth and then you can make your own decisions for yourself. So I'll start with the pros. Obviously, the biggest pro is that you're doing something that you love as your job, right? Something that you feel you are good at, something that makes you feel good, something that you enjoy doing. And so obviously doing something that you love as your job, they say it makes you feel like you don't work a day in your life, is what they say. But of course it's not always like that. But obviously that is the biggest pro. Another pro of being a professional musician is that you can have a lot of really, really cool adventures. And by that, I mean, you could end up touring with an orchestra, traveling the world as a soloist. You could get these like gigs somewhere for a wedding that could be in like Hawaii or Mexico or like something really very cool, which I feel like you can't get with all kinds of jobs. So I feel like being a professional musician is like such an adventure and you never know what's gonna happen. So I think that's super cool. About 2 years ago, I got a call that they needed a flute player in a youth orchestra as a sub for their Europe trip, and it ended up being so fun. And it was just like literally a month later I was in Europe. So I think just the pro of being a professional, and I'm talking more about freelancing musician, is that your life will be an adventure. Number 3, as a professional musician, you can become a music teacher. And for me, that is my favorite part of teaching and the part I find the most rewarding. And I think that as a music teacher, you can make a really big impact on children's lives and what they do for the rest of their life. And it's not saying that they will become professional musicians, you never know. And you don't really go in with that assumption. But music builds confidence, it builds skills, responsibility, and you make friends through music. I remember in school I did band and youth orchestra, and it was just so much fun. So I think that you have this job of bringing music to the younger generation and inspiring them, and I think that's just so amazing, and I definitely think that's a really big pro. And finally, unless you are working like a music school job, you'll most likely not have a 9-to-5 schedule, which some people really don't like, to work like specific 8 hours every day. So I think that's super cool that you can be in charge of your own schedule. Like some days I'll be like, oh, I want to take a trip here. Oh, sorry, I'm just not available to teach that day. So you can be in charge of your own schedule, which I think is super nice and a lot of people would be jealous of. So I think that's a very cool part about being a freelancing professional musician. All right, let's talk about the cons now. I think for me, the biggest con at first was that your work schedule is different from the average person's work schedule. So when you go to work, which for me is around 2 o'clock, and then I end around 8 o'clock, whereas most people work 9 to 5 and then they're free from like 5 to, the evening. So it does make it harder to meet with friends and stuff like that, especially during the week, because everyone has a different schedule than you. And then once you get off work at 8, you're already pretty dead. And so I think that's a big part. And also when you're doing gigs over the weekend or on Friday nights, obviously it makes it a little bit harder for your social life if you are working all the time or working at the times that people aren't working. So that for me was a big adjustment, and I'm still learning the like work-life balance, but that is definitely, I think, a con to consider. Number 2, and this might not be a con for some people, but your job is not as stable as some people's jobs, right? So my job, for example, currently does not give me like insurance benefits and retirement plan or anything like that. So I'm actually going to be starting to think soon about what I'm going to do because I'm aging out of my parents' insurance. So that's something to consider. If you are just like a private teacher or a freelancing musician, you're not going to be given, most likely, from what I hear, insurance from your company. So you're going to have to either get a job in a public school or something like that. So it's just something to consider as well if that's like the life that you're wanting, that it is not as stable as those corporate jobs. However, this does not mean that you're going to be broke. And I feel like I need to make that clear because there's the stereotype of musicians just always being broke, having no money and stuff like that. And that's definitely not true. It's just your money will not be like the same every month, if that makes sense. Another con that I don't know if it's specific to where I live because maybe it's not a place of so many performances and gigs, but I feel like you can't totally rely on gigs to make your money. At least for me as a flutist, it's just so competitive And so I feel like if I relied just on gigs and performing to make money, I would definitely be broke, because at least in the Bay Area, there's not as many like gigs really. I'm sure in New York City or like LA, there's much more probably out there. But here, like, gigs pay a lot less. Like, I think it depends obviously what the gig is, but most gigs that I've done have been like under $200 like for the gig, and then you also have to practice for it, you have to drive to it, you have to cancel your students for it. So for me, those aren't always worth it unless it's something really, really cool that I want to do. But yeah, so just something to consider. Like, the gig life is rough, and I commend everyone who like does that. And I see a lot of like freelancers that are doing it full time, and I think that's so like admirable. I wish I could do that, but for me, it just like stresses me out and takes a lot of time and driving and stuff like that. So for me, I personally prefer teaching. But the really cool thing about music is you can do so much with it. If you're more of like a teacher and you think you want to teach kids more, you can do that. If you really like performing and want to try to go all in with that, you totally could. I think the cool thing too is that it's not set. Like, as you're going through your career, you could change paths and be like, okay, I really want to be performing more, and then really, really work on networking and really get in there. You totally could do it. I think for me, I've realized what I like better, but maybe that will change in a little bit. So at least where I'm living, I think it's harder to just rely on gigs to make money, but I'm sure that it depends for different people, different instruments. I also only really play one instrument. If you're a doubler, you have so many opportunities. So if you're younger and you're watching this, then consider learning more instruments, especially if you're like a woodwind player and you just play flute. Consider learning clarinet, saxophone, like bass clarinet, maybe oboe too. That way you can get like musical gigs and stuff like that, because oftentimes they don't want to hire 10 people, so they'd rather hire just one person who can play all of those instruments. So just something to consider. Another con, and this is more specific to flute, but if you choose a very competitive instrument, you're going to have a hard time getting gigs, because there's already the people who are like established where you live, right? And then like there's the new people that are coming in. And so of course at first they're gonna, will rely on the people who are established, and then it takes time to get into the business, right? However, as a music teacher, it is great that a lot of people play the flute, because it gives me a lot of students. So again, probably not going to change your instrument based on this video, but something to consider when you're choosing your instrument is how competitive is it, and then what do I want to do with it? If you're really wanting to get into performing, I don't know, I might have gone back and chosen an instrument that's a little less competitive, because you'd have more opportunities, more scholarship opportunities. I would say like the oboe and the bassoon, I think, get a lot more scholarships and stuff like that when they're applying for schools, whereas flute, there's already like a gazillion of them. And so you're already having to compete with all these other people, and then to like get any kind of scholarship, you need to be really, really good. And so it's just rough in the flute world, but just something to consider. I've heard violin is kind of like that too, but in an orchestra, there's only even like 2 flute spots, which is insane. So just something to consider when you're choosing your instrument or deciding to go professional. All right, well, hope this video was helpful. Make sure you subscribe for more videos. And yeah, those are the realities of being a professional musician.